The day I turned 74, I sat alone at my kitchen table in Oakville with a grocery store cake I'd bought for myself, and I thought, this is how it ends, not with a bang, not even with a whimper. Just a woman, a yellow cake with white frosting, and a dining room so quiet she could hear the refrigerator hum. My daughter had called 3 days earlier. She said she and her husband were taking the kids to a cottage up near Muskoka for the long weekend. She said it in the same voice she uses to tell me the highway is backed up, like it was information, not a wound. My son hadn't called at all. He sent a text at 11:47 that night. Just the birthday cake emoji and a thumbs up. I remember staring at that thumbs up for a long time. I've lived in this house for 31 years. I raised 2 children in it. I painted the kitchen 3 times trying to find the right shade of yellow. I sat at the same table helping with homework, filling out university applications, listening to breakups and job losses and in-laws who didn't understand. And now I was sitting here alone with a fork in my hand and a single candle I hadn't bothered to light. And somewhere north of the city my family was having a weekend I hadn't been invited to. I should tell you about Walter first. We were married for 42 years. He was a quiet man, an electrician who read history books, who made terrible puns, who always knew when I needed tea without me saying a word. We had our hard years, every marriage does, but we built something together. We built this house into a home. We built 2 children who, somewhere along the way, I don't think either of us built as well as we thought. Walter died 19 months before my birthday, bowel cancer. 8 months from diagnosis to the end. I held his hand through all of it. The hospital in Hamilton, the palliative unit, the last morning when the light came through the blinds in thin strips, and he just stopped. Our daughter, Renee, came for the last week. That was good of her, but our son Marcus flew in from Calgary the day after Walter passed. He shook my hand at the funeral home. His own father, and he shook my hand. I kept thinking about that for weeks afterward, the grip of it, formal and brief, like we'd just closed a business deal. The funeral was small. Walter was a private man. We had maybe 30 people in the chapel, his old colleagues, a few neighbors, our friends Carol and Don who'd known us since the kids were in school. Renee sat beside me. Marcus sat 2 seats down with his wife, Andrea, who spent most of the service looking at her phone with it tilted at an angle she must have thought was subtle. Afterward at the house, I watched Marcus move through the rooms like he was taking inventory. He went into Walter's office twice. The second time I followed him. He was standing at the filing cabinet. He looked up when I came in and smiled, and the smile didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. Just seeing if Dad had any documents I should know about, he said. I told him I'd handle the paperwork. He nodded and went back to the kitchen and poured himself a scotch from the bottle he'd brought, not from the one already open on the counter. Walter had a will. He was a careful man who believed in being prepared. The house was mine. The savings account was mine. We had about $340,000 set aside over 40 years of working and not spending carelessly. There was his truck, some tools, his coin collection that he'd been adding to since he was a boy. He left a letter for each of the kids. I don't know what was in them because they never told me, and eventually I stopped asking. What I know is that after the will was read, Marcus called me from Calgary and asked about the coin collection. Not how was I doing, not was I sleeping. The coin collection? I told him it was still in the oak cabinet in the office. He said he'd like to come get it sometime. I said of course. He never came. The 19 months after Walter died were the loneliest of my life, and I have had some very lonely stretches. I had retired from my job at the credit union the year before Walter's diagnosis. I had a routine, morning walk, coffee, reading, lunch, some gardening in the good months. I had Carol and Don nearby. but there is a specific quality of quiet that settles into a house where one person used to be and isn't anymore. It's not just silence, it's the shape of absence. The mug on the wrong side of the drying rack, the side of the bed that doesn't need making, the habit of turning to say something to someone who isn't there. Renee called every Sunday for the first few months, then every other Sunday, then whenever she remembered, which was less and less. She lived in Burlington, 40 minutes away, but we saw each other maybe once every 6 weeks. She had her life, her husband Greg, their 2 kids, a house they were always renovating, a schedule that seemed to leave no gap for a mother sitting alone in Oakville with a refrigerator that hummed. Marcus sent money for Christmas. An e-transfer, $200, no note. I thanked him by text, because that's what we become. I want to be fair. I don't think they woke up one day and decided to stop caring. I think it happened the way most slow losses happen, gradually, and then all at once. I think I made it easy for them by asking for nothing, by saying I was fine when I wasn't, by answering, "How are you?" with "good," managing well every single time because I didn't want to be a burden. That was my mistake. Not the biggest one, but mine to own. The birthday was the thing that finally broke something open in me. Not broke, that's the wrong word. Something that had been asleep for a long time just quietly woke up and looked around and said, "Oh, I see." I sat at that table until 9 o'clock at night. I ate 2 slices of the cake. I drank a glass of wine and then another. I thought about Walter. I thought about the early years when birthdays were a whole production. He'd make reservations somewhere, or the kids would make me breakfast in bed when they were small, syrup everywhere. Orange juice with the pulp still in, because Renee hadn't figured out the strainer yet. I thought about how things shift so gradually. You don't notice until you're sitting alone in a kitchen. You painted 3 times and the best birthday message you got all day was a thumbs up emoji. Then I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I took out a notepad, a real paper notepad, the kind I used to use for grocery lists, and I started writing down what I had. Not what I'd lost. What I had. The house was paid off. I'd had it assessed the previous spring for insurance purposes. $18,7500 in the current market. The savings were still mostly intact. I lived carefully on my pension and CPP and had barely touched the principal. Walter's life insurance had paid out $200,000, which sat in a GIC I hadn't decided what to do with. There was the coin collection in the cabinet. There was the old cedar cabin up near Parry Sound that Walter's parents had left him, which neither of the kids had shown any interest in since they were teenagers, but which I'd been quietly maintaining because I loved it and because Walter had loved it. I sat there looking at the list, and I thought, I am not a woman with nothing. I am a woman who has been acting like she has nothing because the people who were supposed to see her stopped looking. I called my friend Carol the next morning. Carol is 71 and has known me since our children were in the same class at St. Matthew's. She's the kind of woman who says exactly what she thinks, but does it gently enough that you can hear it. I told her about the birthday. I told her about the birthday. I told her about the cake I bought myself. I heard her breathing on the other end of the line, and then she said, "Dorothy, you need to talk to a lawyer." I said, "About my birthday," she said, "about all of it." I thought about that for 3 weeks before I did anything. I'm not an impulsive person. Walter used to say I could think a decision to death, which was sometimes true. But this time I needed the 3 weeks. I needed to sit with what I was considering and be sure it wasn't grief, wasn't loneliness, wasn't the wine from my birthday talking. It wasn't. I had a lawyer, a woman named Patricia Chen, who had handled Walter's estate, who I'd always liked for her directness and her complete absence of sentimentality. I called her office on a Tuesday morning in November, just after the first snow. I drove in with the wipers going and a Tim Hortons coffee in the cup holder because some things are constant. I sat across from Patricia in her office on Trafalgar Road, and I told her I wanted to review my will. She pulled it up on her screen. The current will, which we had updated after Walter died, split everything equally between Renee and Marcus. The house, the savings, the cabin, everything. Standard, obvious, written by a woman who assumed that her children, because they were her children, would always show up. I told Patricia I wanted to change it. She didn't raise her eyebrows. She just said, "Tell me what you're thinking." I thought about Renee. I thought about the Sunday calls that dwindled. I thought about the cottage weekend. I thought about Greg, her husband, who I had never once heard ask me a single question about my life. Not what I was reading, not how I was managing the house, not whether I was lonely. I thought about the way Renee sometimes talked about the house in a particular tone. A tone I'd started to recognize only recently, like she was noting dimensions. I thought about Marcus. I thought about the handshake at the funeral home. The coin collection question. The $200 e-transfer with no note. Then I thought about Renee's oldest, my granddaughter Sophie. Sophie is 19, in her first year at the University of Guelph. She calls me every Wednesday evening, not because anyone told her to, but because sometime in the last 2 years she just started doing it. She drives out to Oakville and has lunch with me on her reading weeks. She sat with me for an entire weekend after Walter died. She was 17, she had other places to be, and she just stayed and helped me sort through some of his things, and watched old hockey games with me on TV, because Walter had liked hockey and neither of us could stand the quiet. She texted me a real message on my birthday. Not an emoji, a paragraph. She said she was sorry she couldn't be there, that she had an exam the next morning, that she was making me dinner when she came home for Thanksgiving, and I wasn't allowed to help. She said she missed Grandpa, and she missed me, and she hoped I'd had a piece of something sweet. I told Patricia about Sophie. Patricia made some notes and looked at me across the desk. She said, "You understand this will cause conflict." I said, "I did." She said, "And you've thought about this carefully, not just recently." I said I'd been thinking about it for 19 months, probably longer, if I was honest. Patricia nodded slowly and said, "All right, let's talk about structure." We spent an hour and a half in that office. What we worked out was this. The house would be placed in a trust, with me retaining full use of it for the rest of my life. Upon my death, the house would go to Sophie. The savings, the original $340,000, as well as the insurance GIC, would also go to Sophie in a structured arrangement that would release portions to her at 25, 30, and 35, so she wouldn't be 22 and overwhelmed with money she didn't know how to manage. The cabin near Parry Sound I left to Carol and Don, because they had spent weekends up there with us for 20 years, and they loved it like we did, and leaving it to people who would actually use it felt like the only honest thing. I left Renee and Marcus each $10,000. It was not nothing. It was also not nothing else. I also left them each a letter. I didn't write the letters with anger. I tried very hard not to. I wrote them at the kitchen table on a Saturday afternoon in December, with the snow coming down outside and a pot of soup on the stove. I wrote them the way I would have wanted to be written to, honestly, without cruelty, without a list of grievances that would just make them defensive. I wrote about what I had hoped for. I wrote about what had changed. I wrote that I still loved them because I did. That would never stop, but that love has to show up. That showing up means something, that I had spent 40 years showing up, and the last 2 years learning what it felt like when no one showed up for me. I wrote that I hoped they would be kind to their own children, kinder than they had been to me, because I knew what it felt like now to be on the other side, and I would not wish that feeling on anyone. I sealed the letters and gave them to Patricia to be included with the estate documents. I drove home with the wipers going again. I made myself dinner, just pasta with olive oil and the good parmesan, and I sat at the same kitchen table where I'd eaten birthday cake alone. But it felt different. Not lighter, exactly. More like settled, like I'd finally said something true instead of just absorbing it. Sophie came for Thanksgiving like she promised. She made roast chicken with rosemary potatoes, and she brought a butter tart from a bakery in Guelph because she knows I love butter tarts more than almost anything else. We ate at the table and she talked about her classes, her roommate, a professor who made her feel like history was something you could actually touch. After dinner, we sat in the living room and she showed me photos from her first few weeks at school, and I looked at her, really looked at her, this girl who had my Walter's eyes and her mother's jawline, and something entirely her own in the way she tilted her head when she was thinking. I had not told her about the will. I would not tell her. That wasn't why I'd done it. I had done it because it was true. Because the will, at its root, is not a financial document. It's a record of a life. It's the last chance a person has to say what mattered, who showed up, what love looked like in practice rather than in theory. I had written a will once that said nothing true about my life at all. It just divided things evenly because even was supposed to mean fair. I know better now. That night, after Sophie left, I locked the front door and turned off the kitchen light and stood for a moment in the front hallway. Outside, the maple in the yard had lost most of its leaves. The street light made them look orange on the dark pavement. Walter had planted that maple when we first moved in, when Marcus was 2 and Renee was 4. We stood out there in October with a sapling and a rented auger, and the kids running around in the leaves, and thought we were planting something for all of us. I suppose in a way we were. It just turned out to be mine. I went upstairs, made tea, and sat in bed with my book, and for the first time in a long time I was not waiting for a phone that wasn't going to ring. I was just a woman in her own house at the end of her own day, at peace with what she had finally decided to keep. There's a particular kind of clarity that only comes when you stop pretending everything is fine. I spent a long time being fine. I said it so often it became a reflex. How are you? Fine. Managing well. Don't worry about me. And I believed, somewhere underneath all that fine, that the people who loved me could see through it anyway. That they knew. That they just needed time, or were busy, or would show up when it really mattered. The birthday was when I understood they wouldn't, not because they were cruel people. Renee and Marcus didn't wake up one morning and decide to abandon their mother. It happened the way water erodes stone, slowly, quietly through years of small choices that individually meant nothing and collectively meant everything. A call not made, a visit postponed, a thumbs-up emoji instead of a voice, each one barely a ripple, all of them together, a canyon. I think about cause and effect a lot now, not in any mystical sense, just the plain, practical reality that what we do accumulates, the attention we give or withhold, the times we show up or don't. These things don't disappear. They settle into the foundation of a relationship, and over time, that foundation either holds or it doesn't. By the time I was sitting alone with a grocery store birthday cake, the foundation had been crumbling for years. I just hadn't let myself look at it directly. What Sophie taught me, without meaning to, just by being herself, is that decency is a choice you make in small moments. She calls on Wednesdays. She drives out on reading week. She stayed with me the weekend Walter died, and didn't make it about anything other than being there. None of that is dramatic. None of it cost her much. It's just the quiet, consistent work of actually caring about another person. And she does it without being asked and without keeping score. That's what I tried to say in the letters I left for Renee and Marcus. Not that I'd stopped loving them, but that love has to show up in the world somehow. It has to have a shape. A phone call has a shape. Driving 40 minutes has a shape. And the thumbs up emoji at the end of a long lonely day also has a shape, just not the one they probably intended. Changing the will wasn't revenge. I want to be clear about that, at least with myself. It was honesty. It was finally writing a document that told the truth about my life instead of the life I'd hoped for. Sophie didn't earn what I left her by being strategic or by calculating. She earned it by being the kind of person who, without any particular fanfare, made me feel like I mattered. That's not a small thing. In the end, it might be the only thing. I'm 74 years old. I've buried a husband. I've raised 2 children who drifted and watched a granddaughter grow into someone steady and kind. I've learned, later than I should have, that you cannot pour yourself out indefinitely for people who never refill you, that protecting your own life, your peace, your time, your remaining energy is not selfishness. It's the most honest form of self-respect there is. The maple Walter planted is still out front. It's taller than the roofline now. I look at it sometimes from the kitchen window and think about what we plant and what actually grows, and whether those 2 things are ever quite the same. I'm still learning to be all right with the difference.